The smell of gardenias is something I will never separate from that evening. My daughter-in-law had insisted on gardenias everywhere. Centerpieces, boutonnieres, the archway over the entrance, even small clusters tucked into the napkin rings. She said it was elegant. What she meant was expensive. I had paid for all of it. I was standing near the bar at the far end of the reception hall when I heard the sound. Not a slap, something worse. A chair scraping hard against marble, and then my granddaughter Nora's voice cutting through the music. Not crying. Just that particular silence that comes before crying. The kind where a person is trying very hard to hold it together in public and failing. My name is Arthur Calloway. I'm 64 years old. I spent 31 years building a regional freight logistics company in Central Ohio, starting with 2 leased trucks and a phone I shared with my wife Sandra at the kitchen table. We moved 12 tons of agricultural equipment for a single client that first year. By the time I handed operational control to my VP of logistics last spring, we were moving product through 14 states with a fleet of 240 vehicles. I tell you that not to impress you. I tell you that because a man who builds something like that from a folding table in a duplex in Columbus does not get surprised easily. He learns early how to read a room, how to read a deal, and most importantly, how to read a person. I had been reading my daughter-in-law Simone for 14 months, and I did not like what I saw. But that evening, I still believed in giving people the benefit of the doubt. I had raised my son Philip to be fair-minded, and I was trying to model it. The party was a retirement celebration. My wife Sandra, after 38 years as a pediatric nurse at Riverside Hospital, had finally agreed to stop working. Our kids had organized the dinner at the Whitmore Estate, a venue in Westerville that Simone had selected and that I had paid for without complaint. 220 guests. An open bar. A live quartet in the corner playing something soft and forgettable. Sandra had not wanted a party this large. She'd told Philip she'd be happy with dinner at the house and a cake from the bakery downtown where we'd been buying birthday cakes since he was 4. Simone had overruled her. Said it had to be done properly. Said Sandra deserved to be celebrated. What Simone actually wanted was a venue she could photograph for her social media pages, where she had been positioning herself as the wife of a successful family, the daughter-in-law of means. I let it go. I wrote the check. What I could not let go was what I watched happen 40 minutes into the cocktail hour. Nora is my granddaughter from my daughter Felicity. She's 19, finishing her sophomore year at Ohio State, studying early childhood education. She was born with a moderate hearing impairment and has worn hearing aids since she was 2. She is the most perceptive young woman I have ever known. She reads people the way her grandfather does, and she has her grandmother's patience. Simone had seated Nora at a corner table near the kitchen entrance, not with the family, not near Sandra, at the corner table next to the catering station where servers kept bumping the back of her chair carrying trays in and out. I had noticed it when we sat down for dinner and felt something tighten in my chest. But I told myself it was a seating error, an oversight by the event coordinator. I gave the benefit of the doubt. What happened at the bar was not an oversight. Simone was standing with 3 of her friends, women I had met once or twice, women whose names I kept forgetting because there was never a reason to remember them. And she was telling a story, loud enough to carry, loud enough for the small cluster of people near the bar to hear. I caught the tail end of it, the part where she tapped the side of her head twice, the universal gesture people make when they want to imply someone is not quite right, and she was smiling while she did it, the kind of smile that performs for an audience. Nora was standing 5 feet away, waiting for a glass of water. I do not know if Nora heard it directly or read Simone's lips, or simply understood what was happening from the reaction on the faces of the people listening, but she set her empty glass down carefully on the bar, turned and walked back toward the kitchen entrance and sat down alone at her corner table. Her back was straight. Her face was composed. She did not cry. She was trying not to humiliate her grandmother at her grandmother's party. That was the moment I stopped giving the benefit of the doubt. I did not make a scene. I did not raise my voice. I am 64 years old, and I have been in enough rooms where someone thought they had the advantage to know that the worst thing you can do in that situation is let them see you react. I set my bourbon down on the bar. I walked over to Sandra's table, leaned down, and told her I needed to check on something with the venue manager and I'd be back in 10 minutes. She looked at me. We have been married for 41 years. She already knew. I found the venue manager, a man named Douglas, in the back office off the main corridor. Douglas had worked with my company 4 years ago when we used this venue for our annual contractor summit. He was a straight-talking man from Zanesville who did not waste my time and expected the same in return. I told him I needed to end the event early, not dramatically, not loudly, just cleanly. He asked what I needed. I told him. At exactly 9:45, the quartet stopped mid-song. The lights in the main hall came up to full, the kind of flat overhead fluorescence that makes everyone look tired and the room look smaller than it is. Douglas walked to the small podium near the entrance and tapped the microphone once. He thanked the guests for coming, said there had been an unexpected scheduling conflict with the venue and the evening would need to conclude by 10 and that cars could be validated at the front desk. There was the predictable shuffling, some confused murmuring. Simone moved through the crowd toward me like a woman who had just been interrupted mid-performance. She asked me what was happening, voice low and controlled, with that particular smile she wore when she was angry and did not want anyone to know it. I told her the evening was over and thanked her for organizing it. She stood very still for a moment. Then she looked at the room, the guests gathering their things, the staff already breaking down the bar, and she understood that I had done this, that I had chosen to end the night without a confrontation, and that there was nothing she could do about it in front of 220 people without making herself look exactly like what she was. She walked away without another word. Sandra and I drove to Felicity's house that night and sat with Nora at the kitchen table until almost midnight. Nora told us what she had overheard. She had heard more than I knew. Simone had been making those comments to that particular group of friends for most of the cocktail hour. She had called Nora's hearing aids a liability. She had said in Nora's presence and loud enough to be intentional that it must be difficult for Felicity raising a child with limitations. She had then turned and looked directly at Nora and said she hoped Nora wasn't planning on being a teacher, that children needed adults who could hear the full classroom. Nora told us this flatly, without drama. 19 years old, sitting at her mother's kitchen table in a dress she had bought on sale for her grandmother's party, telling us what had been said to her face. Sandra put her hand over Nora's and didn't say anything. She didn't need to. I drove home that night and sat in my study for 2 hours. What Simone did not know, what she had never bothered to find out, because she had decided very early that she already understood our family, was that the Whitmore Estate venue where she had thrown the party was managed under a property group I had quietly acquired a 40% stake in 3 years earlier as part of a tax-structured investment portfolio. Douglas did not work for the venue. Douglas, in a meaningful sense, worked for me. She also did not know what my attorney Leonard had been sitting on for the past 6 weeks. I had hired a private investigator in January, not because I wanted to find something, because something my VP, a sharp woman named Patricia, had mentioned in passing about a conversation she'd had with Philip's business partner landed wrong with me. Patricia said Philip's partner had mentioned, casually, that Philip was looking to bring in outside capital for a new real estate venture. Philip worked in commercial real estate development. That part was not unusual. What was unusual was that Patricia said his partner had mentioned the source of the capital was family-backed, and the numbers being discussed were not small. Philip had not mentioned any of this to me. Leonard's investigator came back in 5 weeks with a document trail. Simone had spent the previous 8 months telling a circle of her family's contacts in Columbus's real estate community that she and Philip had direct access to operational funding from Calloway Freight, my company, through what she described as a family trust arrangement. She had used those representations to position Philip's new development LLC as a better credit risk than it was. 2 private investors had written checks based on that positioning. A third was in conversation. None of it was true. There was no trust arrangement. Philip had no access to Calloway Freight's capital structures. He knew this. What he may not have fully understood was that his wife had been using our family name and my company's reputation to raise money they had no legal standing to raise. In Ohio, that is fraud. I did not call Philip the night after the party. I did not call him the morning after. I let 4 days pass. I went to work, had lunch with Sandra at the diner on Henderson, and on Thursday morning I called Leonard and told him we were moving forward. Leonard filed a cease and desist notice with both private investors, informing them of the misrepresentation and formally notifying them that no family trust arrangement existed. He included a detailed timeline of the representations made by Simone and the documentation supporting each one. Within 48 hours, both investors had pulled their capital from Phillips LLC. Philip called me on a Friday afternoon. He was not shouting. He was something quieter than shouting, which was worse. He asked me what I had done. I told him I had protected my company's name, which his wife had been using without authorization to solicit investment capital, and that I had an obligation to inform the affected parties. He said I had destroyed 2 years of his work in 48 hours. I told him that Simone had spent 8 months building something on a foundation she did not own, and that foundations like that do not hold. He told me I had always made him feel like he was competing with the company for my attention, that Sandra and I had never fully accepted Simone, that we were punishing her for the party. I let him say everything he needed to say. Then I told him that what happened to Nora at that party was not a social mistake. It was not a bad night. A woman who mocks a hearing-impaired 19-year-old to her face at a family event, loudly, in front of an audience, is telling you exactly who she is. And a man who wants to keep my company's name in his back pocket while his wife uses it to take money from people who don't know better is also telling me something. He hung up. 2 days later, Simone posted a long statement to her social media accounts. She wrote about toxic family dynamics, about in-laws who could not accept a woman with her own ambitions, about being systematically excluded and undermined. She mentioned, without naming names, that a powerful family member had interfered in her husband's business out of personal resentment. She used every phrase that reads as sympathetic in that format: boundaries, emotional safety, protecting her peace. Within a day, the post had several thousand interactions. Her followers were telling her to leave, to protect herself, that she deserved better. What they did not know, what those thousands of strangers clicking and commenting had no way of knowing, was that 6 weeks before the party, Sandra and I had hosted a dinner for Philip and Simone at our house in Dublin. A quiet dinner. Just the 4 of us. Sandra had made pot roast, which Philip had loved since he was a kid, and I had opened a bottle of red I'd been saving. I had wanted that dinner to go well. I had been hoping, genuinely, to find some footing with Simone, some common ground that would make the next 10 or 20 years easier for our family. Simone spent 40 minutes of that dinner on her phone. She answered 2 questions Sandra asked her directly with single sentences and then looked back at the screen. When I asked her about a project she had mentioned previously that she was working on, she corrected my description of it with an edge in her voice that made Sandra glance at me across the table. She left before dessert, saying she had an early call in the morning. Philip stayed for another hour. He apologized for her, quietly, in the way he had been apologizing for her for over a year. That dinner was the last time I tried. I did not post a response to Simone's statement. Leonard advised against it, and he was right. What I did instead was send a single email to the third investor who had been in conversation with Phillips LLC, the one who had not yet signed. A professional contact of mine, a man who deserved to make an informed decision. I copied Leonard. I laid out the facts without editorializing. The investor withdrew from the conversation by end of business that day. Philip called again that night. This time, he was not quiet. He told me I was burning his life down piece by piece, and that I was doing it because I had never respected him as a man independent of my company and my money. He said I had used the Nora situation as an excuse to go after Simone because I had never liked her from the beginning. I waited until he was finished. Then I told him there was a difference between not liking someone and watching someone use your family's name to commit fraud. I told him I had tried to find a way to like Simone for 14 months, and that dinner in November had been the last of those attempts. I told him that a woman who sits at his mother's retirement party and calls a hearing-impaired teenager a liability in front of strangers has no use for family. She has a use for what family can provide. I told him that I was his father and I was telling him the truth, and that what he did with it was his choice. I did not hear from him for 3 weeks. What happened during those 3 weeks was not something I engineered. I want to be clear about that. I had not anticipated it. I had not planned it. Simone's brother Owen worked in the same corner of Columbus's commercial real estate world as Philip. Owen had his own LLC, his own small portfolio of properties, his own set of professional contacts. And Owen, it turned out, had been aware of what Simone was doing with Calloway Freight's name. He had not been a participant, but he had known. When Leonard's cease and desist letters went out, one of Philip's former investors had a conversation with a broker they both knew. That broker mentioned it to someone else. In smaller professional circles, information moves faster than people expect. Within 10 days of the letters going out, Owen was fielding questions from his own contacts about the family trust arrangement, whether it existed, whether his LLC had any connection to it, whether any of his representations had similarly borrowed from an inflated picture of family capital. He did not. His business was clean. But the questions themselves were damaging enough to cost him a deal he had been working on for 4 months. Owen called Simone. I do not know exactly what was said. What I know is what Philip told me 3 weeks later when he drove out to the house on a Sunday morning without calling ahead. I was in the garage reorganizing a set of toolboxes when I heard his car in the driveway. He stood in the garage doorway for a moment. He looked the way he used to look when he was 12 and had broken something and couldn't figure out how to tell me. Older, obviously. Heavier around the eyes. He told me Owen had confronted Simone, that Simone had admitted, in the course of that argument, that she had known the representations she was making to investors were not accurate, that she had believed, based on things Philip had said over the years about our family's financial position, that the money would eventually be there, that I would not let Philip fail, and that therefore the risk was manageable. She had built her version of events on an assumption about my character and my wallet, and she had done it without telling Philip the full picture of what she was saying to people. Philip sat down on the step between the garage and the mudroom and was quiet for a while. He told me he had not known. I believed him. Philip has never been a sophisticated liar. He inherits that from me. We are both too direct to be convincing when we're hiding something, and I know his face well enough to read it. He asked me if Sandra knew everything. I told him she knew enough. He asked if he could talk to her. I went inside and sat at the kitchen table while the two of them talked in the living room for about an hour. I made coffee. I read the Saturday paper I hadn't gotten to yet. I let them have that time without me in the room because some conversations need to happen without a father listening from the doorway. When Philip came into the kitchen, he sat across from me at the table. He said he was sorry. Not sorry the way people are sorry when they've been caught. Sorry the way someone is when they've been shown something true about a situation they were choosing not to look at directly. I told him I accepted that, and I meant it. What I also told him was that I was not going to restore the investor's confidence in his LLC, that he needed to do that himself, from the ground up on the actual merits of the project, without our family name attached to anything, that if the development was worth funding, he could find capital through his own track record and his own relationships, the way I had found every piece of capital I ever used, by proving to the person writing the check that the risk was worth it. He nodded. He didn't argue. That was the first time in a long time that I felt like I was talking to the man I had raised instead of a version of him that had been slowly edited into something else. Simone filed for a legal separation 8 days later. I found out from Philip in a text message. He said he was doing okay. Sandra drove over to his apartment that afternoon with a pot of soup and a set of dish towels she'd been meaning to bring him for months. She did not comment on the separation. She just put the soup in his refrigerator and sat with him for an hour. That is who Sandra is. The fraud matter ultimately did not go to criminal prosecution. Leonard's assessment was that the investor's documentation was sufficient to support civil recovery, and both investors pursued that route. They recovered their capital through a negotiated settlement that Simone and her family handled privately. I was not involved in those negotiations and did not want to be. I had accomplished what I needed to accomplish, which was separating my company's name from any connection to representations I had never authorized. Nora graduated her sophomore year at the top of her education cohort. She is student teaching at an elementary school in Hilliard this fall. I went to watch her teach a class last Tuesday. She had invited me, said she wanted me to see it. I sat in the back of a first-grade classroom on a chair that was built for someone about 1/5 my size, and watched my granddaughter run a reading group with 7 6-year-olds who are all completely captivated by her. She uses a small device now that connects to a hearing loop system in the classroom so she doesn't miss anything. She had researched it herself, applied for an accessibility grant herself, installed it herself with help from the school's IT coordinator. After class, she walked me to my truck, and we stood in the parking lot for a few minutes in the October cold. She told me she had been angry about the party for a long time. Not crying angry. The kind of quiet angry that sits in your chest and doesn't move. She said what bothered her most wasn't what Simone had said. It was that she had looked around the room afterward and couldn't tell who had heard and who hadn't, and she'd spent the rest of the evening not knowing which faces knew and which ones didn't. I told her I understood that specific kind of not knowing. I told her it was the worst part of being mocked in public. Not the words, but the audience. You can't fully see. She thought about that for a moment. Then she said that being in her classroom every day had mostly fixed it, because in that room she knew exactly who was listening and she got to decide what they heard. I drove home thinking about that for a long time. Sandra and I still sit on the back porch most evenings when the weather allows. The oaks we planted when we bought the house are big enough now to give real shade. We drink decaf and watch the light go off the yard and talk about small things, a story she heard, something funny that happened at the senior center where she volunteers on Tuesdays, whatever Nora texted that day. Philip calls once a week. He is working on a smaller residential development in Gahanna now, a project he put together with two partners he's known for a decade, funded with capital he raised on his own track record. He sounds like himself again. That's the best way I can put it. I don't know yet what the shape of things will be between us in 5 years, but I know what my son sounds like when he's standing on ground he built himself, and that is what I hear in his voice now. I do not carry satisfaction about what happened. I want to be honest about that, because I think people sometimes tell these stories as though they enjoyed every moment of it, and I didn't. Watching the investors withdraw, watching Phillips LLC unravel, sitting in my study at night knowing that my son was somewhere across town trying to understand what his marriage had actually been. None of that felt like a win. It felt like surgery, necessary and unpleasant, and something you do not volunteer for. But I will tell you what I know at 64, after building a company from a leased truck and a shared phone and 4 decades of learning the difference between people who are with you and people who are alongside you waiting to see what advantage opens up. Loyalty is not the same as proximity. The people who show up at the party are not always the people who are in your corner. Sometimes the most important thing a man can do for his family is refuse to be the foundation for something built to use them. Not because it's easy, not because it doesn't cost him something real, but because some structures should not be allowed to stand. If you've been watching someone use your trust as building material for something you never agreed to build, I want you to hear this clearly. Your name has value. Your reputation has value. What you've earned over a lifetime of honest work is yours to protect, and you do not owe access to it to anyone who hasn't demonstrated that they know how to carry it. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from, and if this story landed close to home. Share it with someone who needed to hear it today. There are more stories coming. Every one of them is about people who decided that respect was non-negotiable, no matter what it cost them to hold that line. I've thought a lot about what actually went wrong in all of this, and I keep coming back to the same place. Not Simone. Not even Philip's silence that night at the party. What I keep coming back to is the slow accumulation of small decisions, mine included, to look the other way and call it patience. I told myself for 14 months that I was being fair-minded, that I was giving her room. What I was actually doing was letting a situation build that had no foundation and calling my inaction good manners. A man who spends 40 years in freight logistics learns fast that a load improperly secured doesn't announce itself until it's already falling. I knew something was unsecured. I kept driving anyway and told myself the road would smooth out. It didn't smooth out. It dumped on a 19-year-old girl in a party dress at her grandmother's retirement celebration, and Norris sat alone at a corner table near the kitchen and held herself together because she didn't want to ruin Sandra's night. That is what my patience had produced. Not harmony. Just a delayed cost paid by someone who had done nothing to deserve it. What I have learned, not from that night but from the full year of watching what followed, is that consequences are not punishment. People use those words interchangeably, and they are not the same thing. Punishment is something you impose on a person. Consequences are what honest actions produce when you stop shielding people from them. Simone's investors withdrew because they had been given false information and deserved accurate information. Phillips LLC unraveled because it had been built on representations that weren't true. Those outcomes were not things I manufactured out of anger. They were what the situation actually was, once I stopped standing between it and its own weight. I think about Philip standing in my garage doorway looking like he was 12 again, and I don't feel satisfied about it. What I feel is something closer to grief, not for the outcome, but for the years he spent in a situation that was slowly editing him into someone I didn't fully recognize. The man who called me on that Friday afternoon, the one who was quiet and cornered, was not the man I raised. But the man who showed up on a Sunday morning without calling ahead and sat on the mudroom step and told me the truth without asking for anything. That man I recognized. It took losing something real before he could find his way back to himself. I wish it hadn't cost that much. But I don't know what else would have worked. Nora standing in that first-grade classroom last Tuesday is the image I return to when I need to remember why any of it mattered. She researched the hearing loop system herself, applied for the grant herself, stood in front of 7 6-year-olds who had no idea they were in the presence of someone who'd been told, by an adult at a family event, that she had limitations that would define her ceiling. She taught them anyway. She is teaching them right now, this morning, while I sit here writing this. That is what resilience actually looks like. Not dramatic, not performed, just a person showing up every day and doing the work they were told they couldn't do. I am 64 years old. I don't have tidy conclusions about family, or about what loyalty costs, or about where you draw the line between protecting someone you love and enabling something that will eventually harm them. What I have are 41 years with a woman who knew when to put her hand over mine and say nothing, a son who is finding his way back on ground he built himself, and a granddaughter teaching first grade in Hilliard who has already outlasted every small thing anyone ever said about what she was capable of. That is enough. On most days, that is more than enough.